Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Sexuality chapter. So today we're going to talk about some ideas about sexuality and sexual experience that would be pertinent to social psychology. So first thing I'm going to ask you is, tell me about your relationship status. Okay, now for a class like this, the most common relationship status is single. In fact, here are some data, and periodically I'm going to show you some data from a previous class. A lot of this comes from the University of Maryland, where I was teaching previously, but we would expect this to be similar in other places as well. So, about 2/3 of any class, undergraduate class at about this level, would be single. Normally, it's a 200 level class. About 2/3 would be single, about 1/3 in a committed relationship, and then very few would be even cohabiting or married. Cohabiting just means you're living with somebody that you're not married to, uh, who is a romantic partner in this case, and then married is married. Okay, so it's pretty normal to be single, at least at this in the age group that you tend to fit in. Okay, what makes somebody, well, we need to talk about sexual attitudes. So an attitude is evaluation of an object. So we're talking about attitudes involving sex. Okay, so attitudes about sex, etc. There tend to be quite different cultural differences. So for example, in the United States tends to be much more conservative and less permissive in attitudes about things like premarital sex, teenage sex, extramarital sex, and homosexual sex. So that means that we are more conservative, we're more restricted as a culture compared to other cultures. Now, by other cultures, I mean other countries, including Canada, Great Britain, Germany, Israel, Japan. These cultures tend to be more accepting and more permissive of those kinds of things. Now, this is probably due to the religiosity of the United States. We're quite a religious country by and large. But this talks about something called the sociosexual orientation. Now, I'm not talking about your sexual orientation. That's not what this is. This is the sociosexual orientation. What this is your beliefs and behaviors that describe your feelings and attitudes about sex. Okay? So, what you think is right or wrong, good or bad about sex. Now, you have a sociosexual orientation by yourself, but your culture also has a sociosexual orientation. And that sociosexual orientation is anything from permissive to restrictive, right? So, and you're somewhere in the middle, okay? Extremely permissive, extremely restrictive. So, as a culture, you're going to have a sociosexual orientation. So, for example, the United States, the sociosexual orientation of the United States is more restrictive than other cultures. But individual people, like so mine versus yours, they'll be quite different. We have different sociosexual orientations. Those are informed by our culture, but they're different between people. So you tell me, what do you feel like your sociosexual orientation is? All right. Well, this will will contribute to how you feel about a lot of different pieces of information regarding sex, etc. So when I ask this question in a normal class, generally I get about 70% saying somewhat unrestricted to very unrestricted. Um, this is probably more due to the fact that you're a college student, and college students, specifically at the places where I've taught, tend to be more liberal in general and more permissive or unrestricted in their sociosexual orientation. Speaking of, part of sociosexual orientation has to do with your attitudes towards homosexual sex as well as other things. So, what percentage of the United States population identifies as gay or lesbian? In this case, we'll go ahead and include, because the statistic that I got actually was lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. So, uh, any of those, we'll go ahead and what percentage of the United States identifies as non-heterosexual, let's just say it that way, and transgender? Well, the answer is actually a little less than 5%, depending on what demographic we're talking about. So, for example, different parts of the United States have different percentages. A lot of this information can be found, by the way, in the Williams Institute website, which is a UCLA think tank regarding lesbian, gay, and transgender issues through their law school. So, this actual question is a little bit difficult to unpack, though, because there are different ways of asking the question. Are you heterosexual? Are you not heterosexual? Are you gay? Are you lesbian? Are you bisexual? Because there's different ways of determining that. So, for example, If you ask, do you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, uh, the, some of the current statistics find about 4.5% of the overall US population identifies as LGBT or T, right? However, if you ask something like, have you ever been attracted to a member of your own sex or somebody of your own gender, then you'll get different numbers. If you ask, have you ever had a homosexual experience, right, or encounter, then you'll also get different numbers. So, for example, it's more common to uh, have had a homosexual experience, specifically more so for women than for men, than it is to identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, for example. So it depends on how you're asking the questions. But in general, a lot of the statistics hit in terms of identification at about 5% or a little bit less, actually, tends to be pretty common in the United States. All right. When people guess, however, a lot of people guess a lot higher. Now, part of that has to do with studies that have been done in the past and people who have estimated the percentage of lesbian, gay, bisexual in the United States. Now, this did not generally include transgender, but some estimates were about 10% or higher. In reality, there's actually no jurisdiction, at least according to more recent studies, that have found any who've reached 10%, at least in the idea of do you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual. In that particular one, it did say transgender. The highest proportion by far is in the District of Columbia, where the estimate's around 9.8%. But everyone else, every other state in the United States is much closer to 5%. A few are a little bit above by small percentages. Nobody's at, I don't think there's any that are at 6. The state of Colorado, for example, would be 5, I think it's 4.6%. All right. So your sexual attitudes are important in terms of determining what you're going to do and how you interact with the idea of having sex. Okay. Most people in the United States believe that sex among unmarried people is okay, but in the United States, they tend to say if it is affectionate, committed, in an affectionate, committed relationship, right? So even in the United States, the attitude has changed quite a bit in the last 100 to 50 years about whether or not premarital sex is permissible. But the idea of premarital sex outside of a relationship tends to be more frowned upon in the United States than in other places. We need to talk about the sexual double standard because this idea of the interaction between an individual's personal attitudes and the culture really comes to bear in the sexual double standard. Traditionally, in many cultures, and this includes the United States, women who have more permissive sociosexual orientation, specifically behaviors, are judged more negatively than men with similar attitudes and behaviors. This is called the sexual double standard. There's a double standard. Women should be more conservative and restricted in their sociosexual orientation, and men, it's okay to be permissive and unrestricted in their sociosexual orientation. This leads to a lot of different cultural phenomenon, things like the walk of shame. Generally, when you're talking about the walk of shame, that's the idea that a woman comes home after having had a sexual encounter, and it's called a walk of shame. Whereas sometimes it's referred to as a stride of pride, generally for men. Now, I'm not saying that that's universal. I'm not saying it's always a walk of shame for women, it's always a stride of pride for men, but I'm saying that there's definitely a double standard, that women are, it's not okay, it's less okay for women to be permissive in their behaviors and attitudes about sex compared to men. And this leads to what we call the sexual double standard. It's a double standard about what's permissible in terms of sex. Okay, I want you to go ahead and answer this question. Now, of course, I wanted to make sure that you know that this is completely anonymous. I'm not going to go look in your individual data. I don't care. If you don't want to answer, you don't have to answer either. But how old were you when you had sex for the first time? Okay, now, when we ask this question, one of the things that tends to be the most interesting, and this is actual data from a class. I'll give you actually 3 different classes data on this one, is actually the percentage of people who who identify as of being a virgin. So in this particular sample, 31% of the people identified themselves as a virgin. Now, I didn't ask, I didn't like define what it is to be a virgin or anything like that, but this is a pretty common number. This is a little on the high end, perhaps, but between 20 and 30% is very common for this kind of a class. So, for example, here's another one. They had about 26%. Between the ages of 15 and 18 tends to be the most common answer, however, when we ask this question. And if you ask it straight, whether or not you're a virgin, here is another one about, in this case, it was 33% said that they considered themselves to be a virgin. When we look at this age group, though, there we go. There do seem to be a few gender differences overall in the United States. So, for example, women tend to have sex a little bit later than men do for the first time. There's also some actual racial differences. So, for example, white and Asian populations tend to have sex at a later time than other racial groups. Now, the thing, though, that you kind of need to take from this is your attitudes and whether or not when you have sex is mostly the biggest predictor is actually your sociosexual orientation, your own beliefs and values. We've been talking about premarital sex. We already mentioned this one. We've already talked about that as well. Okay. The biggest thing, though, that predicts when you're gonna have sex for the first time is your own attitudes and values. All right, we need to talk about hookups because in the United States, there's been a big change within the last 50 years of courtship behavior. And it's been found that people are dating a lot differently now than they were in like the 1960s and 70s, right? This has led a lot of baby boomer psychologists to be really confused. And so this has led to a bigger increase in in studying hookups. So there is actually a definition for hookups. A hookup is a sexual interaction with non-romantic partner that does not involve any expectation of a lasting relationship. So what this is saying is that a hookup cannot be with your boyfriend or girlfriend. It has to be with a non-romantic partner and without an expectation of a lasting relationship. If it leads to a lasting relationship later, that's a different question. But if the intent was not to have a lasting relationship, that would be a hookup. And notice that this is a sexual interaction, not having sex. So sex is sexual, that is true. But it can be anything from, whatever kind of sex you're thinking about to and I put NICMO. NICMO, when I was in college, they called it a NICMO, a non-committal makeout. It's not a term you need to know for any exams, but that is anything from like kissing to whatever else that would count as a sexual behavior. Now, if you do that with somebody with whom you do not intend to have a continued romantic relationship, that would be a hookup. Now, the reason why this is a big deal is because it used to be that people would date to get to know each other. And the baby boomer researchers were noticing that people in college weren't dating anymore. So when we think about dating, in the 60s and 70s, this was, it's obviously very heteronormative and, culturally normative as well. It would be expected that the man would ask the woman out on a date. And you would date to get to know each other. So it was quite common for a man to ask a woman out on a date when he had never met her before and didn't really even know her name. And it wasn't uncommon for her to say yes in this particular case. Now, obviously, be careful, etc. That was important, but that was what dating meant at the time. And then going steady meant that you had a particular boyfriend or girlfriend. But dating was meant to get to know people. Well, that seems to have changed over the time, specifically in the 1980s and into the 90s. By the 90s, people were really not dating in that way anymore. Instead, they tended to hang out in groups, right? You hang out in groups, and then you decide you like each other, and then you're a couple. You didn't date in order to get to know people. You hung out in order to get to know people. And when you were dating, that meant you were boyfriend and girlfriend. So the concept of going steady became dating. And that's why it's changed quite a bit. Well, the researchers saw this and said, well, what must be happening is that people are hanging out and then they're hooking up, right? They'll hang out with each other, then they'll hook up, and then that might lead to a relationship later on. So let's talk about hookups, and I'm going to ask some questions about this. I want you to think, how many hookups do you think the average student at your university has had in the last month? So the average at the university level has had in the last month. I want you to give me your estimate. And we're going to go kind of through this kind of fast so that I can get to the concept, and we'll go back and look at the numbers in just a minute. So how many hookups has the average student had in the last month, the average student at your university? How many hookups has the average student in this class had in the last month? Not the whole university, just in this class. How many hookups have you had in the last month? So here's what I want to do. I want you to look at the estimate. We'll get to how many you have had in the last month in just a second, but let's get this estimate. So this is the estimate for the people in the class. These are not like random strangers. These are people you've interacted with or seen in class, right? They're not random people. This is the estimate that people give. How many hookups in the last month? This was the reality. These are from the same people. Say that, look at this again. This is what they thought was happening. This is what was actually happening. This leads us to a concept called pluralistic ignorance. Let's keep going with this idea. We'll ask some questions and I'll tell you about pluralistic ignorance in just a second. But here we go. How many hookup partners have you had in the last month? How many hookup partners in the last month? All right, so when you look at this, now think about it. A hookup is the instance of the hookup. You can have multiple hookup partners, meaning you can hook up with the same person more than once. That's what we're saying, right? As long as you didn't expect to have a romantic relationship with them later on, okay? This is the number of hookup partners people have had in the last month. Now, I want you to think about how much did you enjoy your last hookup? Okay, when we ask this, here's what we get. Here's what we get. So first of all, you should know that about 31% of the people have never had a hookup at all. And that's actually pretty common, right? Remember when we were talking about, hanging out and hooking up? Well, it turns out that after the 90s, so starting in the 90s, the actual amount of casual sex decreased from what it was in the 80s. There's actually less hooking up, if that includes sex, than there was in about the 70s and 80s, around that time. That means that there are actually fewer hookups going on than there were in the past. Now, when you look at this, you'll see that there's quite a range of people of how much they enjoyed their last hookup. So if we think about the number 5 or so, 4 or 5 being right in the middle of enjoyment, then you can see that because we have the 31% there, so we're looking for about 35, 28, 35, about half were in the didn't enjoy it range, not at all, and the other half were closer to the top, okay? All right, now, I want you to look at this compared to this. How much did your partner enjoy your last hookup? Now, theoretically, you should have some pretty good knowledge about your individual partner's enjoyment of your last hookup. I mean, you were there, right? Except for those of you who never had one, right? You were there, so you know what was going on. You should be able to make a determination as to how enjoyable they thought it was. When you look at that, this is the estimate for what you think your partner, how much your partner enjoyed it. Now look at that. Look at that. Almost everybody is saying their partner enjoyed it, but in reality, when their experience though was much more evenly distributed, about half and half in terms of the spectrum. This is how much you enjoyed your last hookup. This is how much they enjoyed your partner enjoyed the last hookup. You are assuming that your partner enjoyed it much more than you did overall when you look at these data. Did you regret your last hookup? Well, when you ask this question, you'll find that about 67% said that at least somewhat they did regret their last hookup. Okay? What does this mean? Well, we need to talk about pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistic ignorance is the idea that I am different from the group and I'm wrong. Now, we've talked about this when we talked about bystander intervention, but to remind you, this is really important with this idea of hookup behavior. Pluralistic ignorance means that I think I'm different from the group and I'm wrong. I'm ignorant about my status with the group. What makes it pluralistic is when lots of people have that same ignorance. So look at these data. Let's go back to the data. How many do you think, how many hookups do you think the group has had? When you look at this average, you're assuming the average here would be somewhere around, around 2 or so, maybe around 2 or so, right? In reality, the most common answer by far is 0. So what's going on here is I know that I haven't had a hookup in the last month, and I think I'm different from the group, right? Because I think that everyone else is having hookups, right? I assume that the average is higher than 0 at least, right? So I think I'm different from the group, and I'm wrong about that because the most common answer is 0. Most common answer is 0 by far. What makes it pluralistic is that there are lots of people in the class who have the same incorrect assumption. I think I'm different and I'm wrong. And not only that, but lots of people share that same incorrect assumption. Now, the reason why this is such a big deal is because when we find pluralistic ignorance, that I think I'm different from the group, but I'm wrong, and lots of people have that same ignorance, we find that people tend to react in 2 ways. They either feel isolated, they're alienated from the group, right? I don't belong. I'm not a good college student. I'm not having a college experience because I'm not having a hookup, for example. Or they feel like they need to assimilate with the norm. But what's wrong with that? Well, the problem with that is that they're assimilating to a norm that doesn't exist, right? They're trying to do, they're doing these things assuming that everyone else is doing them, when in reality they're not. Now, regardless of your sociosexual orientation, one of the things that's particularly problematic with hookups is that we find that some studies have found that up to around 50% of sexual encounters in college are happening without any sort of protection, right? So there are actual real health consequences that are going on, not to mention psychological consequences. So for example, this one, the fact that over about two-thirds of the people actually regretted their last hookup. That has psychological consequences. And how pertinent is this pluralistic ignorance? Well, pluralistic ignorance even goes so far as you being ignorant within your own last hookup. So for example, let me find the right one. Here it is. How much you enjoyed your last hookup is across the board. About 50% were okay, 50% weren't, right? You assume that your relationship partner enjoyed it much more than you did. There is pluralistic ignorance even going on when you are thinking about your own last hookup partner. Now, that means that this can lead to both problematic behaviors, feelings of alienation, feelings of assimilation, potentially risky behaviors, and psychological consequences as well that can happen. Now, pluralistic ignorance is not just for hookups. Pluralistic ignorance has also been found in drug use, in binge drinking behaviors, in cheating, academic dishonesty behaviors, even things as recent as ideas of COVID, right? Whether or not people are wearing their mask. Those things have been found pluralistic ignorance. I think I'm different from the group, but in reality, people tend to be much more like me, even though we all think that everything else is going on. All right. Let's talk about sex in committed relationships. So spouses and cohabiting partners do have sex more often than singles do, right? So the idea that, hey, this wild and crazy single person going out and having sex all the time, that's not true. When you have a partner, a committed partner to you, you're going to have more sex overall. Absolutely. It is true that the frequency of sexual intercourse does decrease with age. So generally, older people have a lot less sex than younger people do. And as we saw in the love chapter, the amount of sex does decrease with age. Now, why is that? Well, there's different reasons why. Part of it is the novelty of having sex and a new sexual partner, right? The idea of fantasy and novelty with a new sexual partner. Part of it is just age, just the fact that as people get older, they tend to be less sexually aroused in general. So all of those things contribute to it. Now, I'm not saying that sexual arousal goes away altogether, because that's not true. However, it does decrease and tends to decrease precipitously. And what does that mean? Well, that means that if sex is a major bedrock of your relationship, then just get ready for that to decrease over time, right? Especially in marriages, we find that the amount of sex decreases precipitously in the first few years of marriage and keeps going down over time, right? That's pretty normal thing to happen. When we look at sexual behaviors, sexual orientation is a factor. In fact, this is interesting because it does seem that the sex of the person. Now, when we talk about sex versus gender, sex has to do with the physiological manifestation of maleness and femaleness, right? So the fact that I have an X and a Y chromosome indicates that I am male, right? So that is my sex. Now, gender tends to be the cultural representation of this, being a man, what it means to be a man in the United States. Okay, and we're going to talk about this more in the gender chapter, but with sexual orientation, what we find is that it does seem to be something about males, right? Not necessarily men, but males that is involved. What I mean by that? Well, lesbians have sex less often than other couples do, less than heterosexual couples and less than homosexual men. Gay men have sex more often than any other couples, but they do tend to have less sex than heterosexual couples in the long run, because most of the data that this comes from might be limited, for that matter, from a time when things like gay marriage was not necessarily legal, and so it was much more common for homosexual men to have different sexual partners and not be in a married long-term relationship. Okay, so that means that they would not have an available sexual partner all the time. If you remember, we talked about having an available sexual partner that's committed to you leads to more sex in a lifetime. Okay, sexual satisfaction. So, is it true that the more sex you have, the more satisfied you are with your sex life or with your relationship in general? Well, first thing we need to do is say that in general, people tend to be quite satisfied with their sex lives. In general, most people are satisfied with their sex life. But satisfaction with sex is correlated with frequency. So people who are having more sex tend to be more satisfied with their sex life. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but first let's ask you a question. How satisfied are you with your sex life? All right. We were talking about the idea that in general, people who have sex more often are more satisfied with their sex life. But we also find that couples who are happy in general tend to just enjoy being together. And one of the things they tend to enjoy doing together is having sex. And what this means is that if just having sex would lead to relationship satisfaction, at least, then we would expect that, just anyone who's having a lot of sex would have more relationship satisfaction. And overall, if you just look at that information, it does indicate that people who have more sex tend to be more satisfied. However, what we find that what is probably really going on is that people who have good relationships just enjoy being together. That includes other activities besides sex, right? But it also tends to include sex as well, right? So what we're saying is, if you need to have more satisfaction in your relationship, just having sex is probably not necessarily going to be the answer to it. It needs to be more about enjoying being with the other person and not just sex by itself. All right. So what that means, good sex probably does make partnerships more gratifying, but happy, loving relationships makes sex better as well. It doesn't seem to be one directional. Okay. Thanks, everybody.